Chapter 26. In the Race of Their Lives. By early afternoon, the rain had still not let up in Grunow. The Langer Sea was rough, the wind brisk out on the water, the scene dark and gloomy. But in those days, rowing was one of the most popular Olympic events, and tens of thousands of spectators, most of them German, began to flood into the regatta grounds. They huddled under black umbrellas. They wore black slickers and hats. They filled the massive wooden bleachers on one side of the course, stood shoulder to shoulder at the water's edge, and took refuge under the cover of the huge, permanent grandstand at the finish line. As the start of the first race approached, more than 75,000 fans had packed the regatta grounds, the largest crowd ever to witness an Olympic rowing event. The 8-oared competition was the main event, but not the only rowing race that day. At 2:30 p.m., the 4-man race began. The Swiss jumped out to an early lead but were soon overtaken by the German boat. Inside the shell house, the American boys were waiting. They'd laid Don Hume out on a massage table like a corpse, bundling him up in overcoats to keep him warm and dry. As the boats in the first race approached the finish line, they could hear the roar of the crowd. The fans chanted Germany's name, Deutschland, 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 and Germany sliced across the finish line a full 8 seconds ahead of the Swiss. Then the boys heard another, deeper, more guttural roar rising from the crowd, and a different chant, Sieg Heil, Sieg Heil, Sieg Heil. Adolf Hitler had entered the regatta grounds, followed by a large entourage of Nazi officials. Wearing a dark uniform and a full-length rain cape, he made his way up a staircase and took his place of honor on the wide balcony overlooking the crowd and the Langer Sea. He held up his right hand. The crowd continued to thunder, Sieg Heil, until Hitler lowered his hand. Only then did the racing resume. The crowd soon had plenty of opportunity to make more noise. In the event after event that afternoon, German oarsmen charged down the course ahead of their competition, winning gold medals in the first 5 races. Each time, the Nazi flag was raised at the end of the race, and the crowd sang the national anthem, Deutschland über alles, or Germany above all, a little more loudly. Hitler's chief lieutenants, including Joseph Goebbels and Hermann Göring, his main military advisors, celebrated with each victory. Hitler himself, peering through his binoculars, simply nodded enthusiastically each time a German boat crossed the line in first place. He believed his people were superior. These triumphs were expected. The rain began to taper off. The skies lightened, and the crowd was in a frenzy. It looked as if Germany would sweep the day. Then, in the 6th race, the British pair of Jack Beresford and Dick Southwood rallied terrifically in the final 250 meters and won by almost 6 seconds. For the first time all day, a queer hush fell over the regatta course at Grunow. In the shell house, George Pocock was looking over the Husky Clipper when he paused for a moment and realized suddenly that he was listening to the British anthem, God Save the King. Out of habit, he stood bolt upright, filled with pride. As the final event grew near, the crowd began to grow noisy once more. The 8-oared race was the rowing event that the nations boasted about. This was the ultimate test of young men's ability to pull together. It was the greatest display of power, grace, and guts on water. A little before 6, Don Hume got up from the massage table. He joined the rest of the boys as they hoisted the Husky Clipper to their shoulders and walked down to the water. The Germans and Italians were already in their boats. The Italians were wearing silky light blue uniforms, and they had tied white scarves around their heads, pirate style. The Germans wore white shorts and white jerseys, each emblazoned with a black eagle and swastika on the front. The American boys were wearing mismatched track shorts and tattered old sweatshirts. They didn't want to get their new uniforms dirty. Bobby Mock tucked Tom Bull's lucky fedora beneath his seat in the stern of his shell. The boys huddled briefly with Ulbrichtsen, reviewing the race plan, then stepped into their boat and paddled up the lake towards the starting line. Ulbrichtsen and Pocock climbed up to a balcony of a shell house near the finish line. They were worried. Their boys were good, but with Don Hume looking like a dead man and the crew stuck out in lane 6, they figured their chances of taking gold were slim to none. In Seattle, it was early morning. Harry Rance had risen before dawn and made coffee and turned the radio on, just to make sure it was working. Joyce had come over a bit later and gotten the kids up. Now they were all in the kitchen, eating oatmeal, trying to steady their nerves. All over America, millions of people were tuning their radios to listen in. If they were lucky enough to have a job, they were going into work a little late. If they were lucky enough to still have a farm, they were putting off their chores until later. The story of the track star Jesse Owens had already excited much of the country. Owens, an African-American man, won 4 gold medals in Berlin, dominating the track and field competition and defying Hitler's theory of the Aryan race's supremacy. Owens' victories infuriated the Nazis. Back home, his accomplishments and Hitler's angry reaction reminded America what the Nazis stood for. Americans realized that there was more at stake in these Olympic Games than a few medals. A way of life was at stake. Basic fairness was at stake. Some Americans had never even heard of Seattle before the Poughkeepsie Regatta, but now millions waited anxiously to see what the rough-and-tumble Western boys from Washington would do as Hitler looked on. At 9:15 a.m. in Seattle, as the radio commentary began, Joyce rummaged through her purse and pulled out a small book. She flipped through its pages and carefully extracted a delicate, green, 4-leaf clover. Joe had given it to her years before, and she had pressed it between the book's pages. Now she laid it atop the radio, pulled up a chair, and started to listen. On the Langer Sea, the boys rowed towards the starting line. Rain showers had begun to slant down out of the sky again, but the rain wasn't the problem. They were from Seattle. They'd rowed through much worse rain. The wind, however, was gusting on and off, pushing in bursts and fits at the starboard side of the shell. Up front, Roger Morris and Chuck Day were having a hard time keeping the boat on an even keel. Bobby Moak was manipulating the rudder, desperately trying to keep the shell on a straight course. He didn't like the wind, and he didn't like the looks of Don Hume. He was just paddling, not putting much into his strokes. Joe Rance felt pretty good, though. As the noise of the crowd fell away behind them, the world in the shell had grown quiet and calm. It seemed to be past a time for words. Joe and the boys in the middle of the boat were just rocking gently back and forth, rowing slow and low, breathing in and out comfortably. The boat felt easy under them, sleek and lithe. For Joe, anxiety gave way to a sense of calm. He was more determined than nervous. If Don Hume had the guts to row this race, Joe and the boys were not going to let him down. They pulled the shell into position, backing against a gangway. They were out in the middle of the Langer Sea. Ahead of them, the lake was wide open. The wind was worse than it had been down in front of the grandstands. It pushed at their bow, slapping small, choppy waves against the port side. Roger Morris and Gordy Adams were struggling, stroking in place on the starboard side, trying to lever the boat against the wind and keep the bow pointed more or less down the middle of the lane. In the next lane over, the British boat backed into position. They waited for the start. Bobby Moak hollered instructions up front to Roger and Gordy, who were still focused on straightening the bow. Behind them, and out of sight, the official starter suddenly emerged, holding a flag aloft. Almost immediately, he turned slightly in the directions of lanes 1 and 2, the Germans and the Italians. Then he shouted in the wind, in French, "Partez," and dropped the flag. Bobby Moak never heard him, never saw the flag. Neither, apparently, did British coxswain Noel Duckworth. 4 boats surged forward. The British and the Americans, for a horrific moment, sat motionless at the line, dead in the water. Out of the corner of his eye, Joe saw the Hungarian boat leap forward. A split second later, he saw the British boat do the same. He bellowed, "Let's get out of here." Bobby Moak barked, "Row!" All 8 American oars dug into the water. For another fraction of a second, the Husky Clipper sagged slightly under the boys as nearly a ton of dead weight resisted being put into motion. Then, the boat sprang forward, and the boys were away. They were already a stroke and a half behind in the race of their lives. Bobby Moak had planned to come from behind, as always, but the spectacularly bad start meant that the 2-length handicap of being in lane 6 was even greater now. Moak needed to build up some momentum, and he needed to do it quickly. He shouted at Hume to hit it hard. Hume set a high pace, and the boys dug hard and fast. The Germans and Italians moved briskly to the front of the field. The British boat charged furiously back. At the rear of the field, the American boat began to claw its way forward. As the first boats crossed the 100-meter mark, an announcer called out the standings, and the crowd roared when they heard the Germans were in the lead. The Americans were still in last place, but only a length and a half behind the Germans. Bobby Moak told Hume to ease off on the rate a little bit. They were still nearly sprinting, but Moak figured that with the wind, they had to row at a high rate just to stay in contention. He could only hope they'd still have something left for the real sprint at the end. The boys began to settle in. As they moved out into the widest part of the Langer Sea, the wind grew even stronger. Waves splashed over the small American flag towards the bow of the Husky Clipper. Moke struggled to steer the boat in the wind. Switzerland claimed the lead. At 200 meters, the British surged past Germany and into second place. Bobby Moke watched them, but he didn't take the bait. It was fine with him if the Brits wanted to burn themselves out in the first half of the race. Then, 300 meters out, Moke saw something that chilled him to his core. Don Hume suddenly went white in the face and all but closed his eyes. His mouth fell open. Moke yelled at him, "Don, are you okay?" Hume didn't respond. Moke couldn't tell if he was about to pass out or just in some kind of zone. Either way, it didn't look right. The way he looked, Moke wasn't sure if Hume could even finish the race, let alone sprint when the time for sprinting came. The boats were approaching the 500-meter mark now, a quarter of the way down the race course. Switzerland, Britain, and Germany were tied for the lead. The Americans and Italians were a boat length behind them. Hungary was last. The boats in the inside lanes were moving into the protected part of the lake now, where the water was nearly flat, but the American boys were still being slammed by the winds, spray flying from their oars every time they popped out of the water. The pain started to build. Very slowly they began to fall farther back. By 800 meters, they were dead last again. Over in the sheltered water of Lane 2, Italy came up from the rear and took a narrow lead over Germany. The bow of the Italian boat sliced across the halfway point. A bell began to toll, signaling the spectators at the finish that the crews were approaching. 75,000 people rose to their feet. On the balcony of the main house, House West, Hitler, Goebbels, and Göring pressed their binoculars to their eyes. Next door, Al Ulbrichtsen saw the Husky Clipper struggling down the outside lane. The announcer called out 1,000-meter split times. The crowd roared. Italy was in first, but Germany was close behind. Ulbrichtsen's boys were behind by nearly 5 full seconds. In the stern of the Husky Clipper, Bobby Moke knew he couldn't afford to wait any longer. He hunched forward and bellowed for Hume to take the stroke right up. "Higher," he shouted into Hume's face. "Higher." Nothing happened. "Higher, Don, higher," he screamed, pleading now. Hume's head rocked back and forth with the rhythm of the boat, as if he were about to nod off. He seemed to be staring at something on the floor of the boat. Moke couldn't even make eye contact with him. Germany retook the lead. Another enormous roar went up from the crowd. Then the roaring turned into chanting. The crowd was cheering in time with the stroke rate of the German boat. Deutschland, Deutschland, Deutschland. On his balcony, Hitler rocked back and forth with the chant. In Seattle, a hush fell over Harry Rounce's living room when Joe's family heard the times. In the boat, Joe had no idea how things stood, except that he was vaguely aware that he hadn't seen any boats following away behind him. He knew that meant that they were trailing the field, but he also knew it wasn't because they'd been rowing easy. He had been rowing hard against the wind all the way. His arms and legs were starting to feel as if they were encased in cement. It was too early for the sprint, but he was starting to wonder what would happen when Moke called for it. How much would he have left? How much would any of them have left? Moke was growing desperate. Hume still wasn't responding. The only option Moke had left was to hand the stroke's responsibility off to Joe. It would be a dangerous move that could throw everyone off, but if he could just get Joe to set a higher rate, maybe Hume would sense the change and pick it up. Moke had to do something, and with the finish line approaching, he had to do it now. As Moke leaned forward to tell Joe to raise the rate, Don Hume's head snapped up. His eyes popped open, he clamped his mouth shut, and he looked Bobby Moke straight in the eye. A startled Moke yelled, "Pick her up! Pick her up!" This time, Hume responded. Moke yelled again, "1 length to make up! 600 meters to go!" The boys leaned into their oars. The stroke rate jumped, and then jumped again, climbing higher and higher. At the 1,500-meter mark, the Husky Clipper eased from 5th to 3rd place, but they were still nearly a full length behind Germany and Italy. The Langer Sea narrowed. The Husky Clipper finally sliced into water that was protected from the wind by tall trees and buildings. Conditions were even now. The game was on, but there were only 350 meters to go. The boat began to move, reeling the leaders in seat by seat. With 300 meters to go, the American boys pulled even with Italy and Germany. Approaching the final 200 meters, the boys pulled ahead by 1/3 of a length. Bobby Moke glanced up ahead at the huge black and white Ziel sign, the German word for finish. He began to calculate just what he needed out of the boys. He decided it was time to start lying. Moke barked, 20 more strokes! He started counting them down. 19, 18, 17, 16, 15, 20, 19. Each time he hit 15, he reset back to 20, hoping the boys wouldn't notice. In a daze, the boys threw their long bodies into each stroke, rowing furiously, flawlessly, and with uncanny elegance. Their oars were bending like bows, the blades entering and leaving the water cleanly, smoothly, and efficiently. The shell ghosted forward between pulls, its sharp cedar prow slicing through the dark water. Boat and boys were forged together, bounding fiercely forward like a living thing now. They were in full sprint mode, pulling 40 strokes per minute, when they hit a wall of sound. The boat had reached the bleachers on the north side of the course. In lane 6, the boys were not more than 10 feet away from the edge of the stands. Thousands of spectators stood over them, screaming, "Deutschland! Deutschland! Deutschland!" The sound utterly drowned out Bobby Moak's orders. Not even Don Hume, sitting just 18 inches in front of Moak, could understand the coxswain. The Italians surged. So did the Germans. All three leaders were rowing at a full sprint. The race was even again. Moak yelled and screamed, but nobody heard him. Joe didn't even know what was happening, except that he'd hurt like he'd never hurt in a boat before. He felt like hot knives were stabbing the muscles in his arms, legs, and back. Every desperate breath burned his lungs. On the balcony of House West, Hitler dropped his binoculars to his side. He rocked back and forth with the chanting of the crowd. His henchmen, Goebbels and Göring, were cheering wildly. On the balcony next door, Al Ulbrichtsen stood motionless. His face was blank. He fully expected to see Don Hume collapse over his oar at any moment. Back home in Seattle, the radio announcer was screaming. Harry and Joyce and all the kids couldn't make out what was happening, but they were all on their feet. Out of the corner of his eye, Moak saw the Germans and Italians surging again, and knew that the boys had to go higher still, to give even more than they were giving, even as he knew they were already giving everything that they had. With the wooden handles at the ends of his steering lines, he started banging on iron wood knocker boards on the side of the boat. Even if the boys couldn't hear his commands, maybe they could feel the vibrations, and he needed more. They did. They understood that it was the signal to do what was impossible, to go even higher. Somewhere deep down inside, each of them grasped at shreds of will and strength that they did not even know they possessed. The three boats stormed towards the finish line, the lead going back and forth. Hume took the beat higher and higher until the boys hit 44. They had never rowed at this rate before. They'd never even thought it was possible. They edged narrowly ahead. The Italians began to close again. The Germans were right beside them. Deutschland, Deutschland, Deutschland thundered in the boys' ears. Bobby Moak was pounding the wood, screaming words no one could hear. The boys took one last mighty stroke and hurled the boat across the line. On the balcony, Hitler raised a clenched fist shoulder high. Goebbels leapt up and down. Hermann Göring slapped his knee, a maniacal grin on his face. In the American boat, Don Hume bowed his head as if in a prayer. The German stroke oar toppled backwards into the lap of his number 7 man. In the Italian boat, somebody leaned forward and vomited overboard. The crowd continued to roar, "Deutschland, Deutschland, Deutschland." Nobody knew who had won. The American boat drifted on down the lake, beyond the grandstands, into a quieter world. The boys leaned over their oars, gasping for breath, their faces still shattered by pain. Finally, the loudspeakers crackled back to life with the official results. The bow of the American boat had touched the line 0.6 of a second ahead of the Italian boat and exactly a second ahead of the Germans. The chanting of the crowd faded suddenly. On the balcony of House West, Hitler turned and strode back into the building, unspeaking. His henchmen scurried in behind him. The American boys did not understand the announcement at first, but when they did, their grimaces of pain suddenly turned into broad smiles. In Seattle, Joe's half-siblings whooped and hollered and cheered and tumbled about the house. Harry applauded. Joyce cried. With tears streaming down her face, she carefully returned the 4-leaf clover to her book and hugged Harry for the first time ever. The boys rode slowly past the grandstands to polite applause. Al Ulbrichtsen and George Pocock shoved their way through the crowds, desperately trying to get to their crew. The boys pulled up to the float in front of House West. An official presented them with an enormous laurel wreath. Al Ulbrichtsen arrived on the float, breathless and crouched down by the boat. The wreath had been passed from boy to boy. He pointed to it and grumbled to Roger Morris, "Where'd you get the hay?" Roger motioned over his shoulder with his thumb and said, "Picked it up downstream." The boys climbed out of the shell and stood at attention while the German band played The Star-Spangled Banner. Then they shook some hands, hoisted the Husky Clipper onto their shoulders, and carried it back to the shell house. In their dirty sweatshirts and mismatched shorts, they looked as if they'd just come in from an ordinary workout on Lake Washington. But as their coach would soon attest, they were no ordinary crew. A reporter stopped Ulbrichtsen on the way into the shell house and asked what he thought of his boys. For once, Ulbrichtsen didn't hesitate before he spoke. "They are," he said, "the finest I've ever seen in a shell." The next day, the boys prepared the Husky Clipper for shipment back to Seattle, put on their Olympic dress uniforms, and headed to the Grand Olympic Stadium in Berlin. After the gold medal soccer match between Austria and Italy, the boys took to the field to receive their medals. As they lined up next to the German and Italian crews, Olympic officials went down the American line, hanging gold medals around the boys' necks and placing small laurel wreaths on their heads. Their names appeared on the enormous 43-foot wide announcement board at the eastern end of the stadium. The Star-Spangled Banner began to play, and as the American flag slowly ascended, a flagstaff behind the announcement board rose. As Joe watched the flag rise with his hand over his heart, he was surprised to find that tears had crept into the corners of his eyes. Moke choked up too. So did Stub McMillan. By the time it was over, they were all fighting back tears. That night, as the boys went out on the town, Joe stayed in. He lay awake all night. He spent much of the night simply staring at his gold medal where it hung at the end of his bunk. As much as he had wanted it, and as much as he had understood what it would mean to everyone back home, he realized that the medal wasn't the most important thing he would take home from Germany. Immediately after the race, even as he sat gasping for air in the Husky Clipper, not sure whether they had won, a sense of calm had enveloped him. In the last desperate sprint to the finish, in the searing pain and bewildering noise of the last few moments, Joe had realized with startling clarity that there was nothing more he could do to win the race. Except for one thing. He had to abandon all doubt. He had no choice but to throw himself into each stroke as if he were throwing himself blindly off a cliff. He had to trust absolutely that the others would be there to save him from catching the whole weight of the boat on his blade. And he had done it, over and over, 44 times per minute. Not just believing, but knowing that the other boys would be there for him. All of them. In those final few meters, Joe and the boys had finally forged the prize they had sought all season, the prize Joe had sought nearly all his life. Each had entirely given himself up to being a part of something larger and more powerful and more important than himself. Now, finally, Joe felt whole. He was ready to go home.